From DLA Piper, this is the U.S. Latin America Panorama Podcast. This podcast series focuses on the latest developments across the Americas and globally, highlighting business, legal, economic, and political developments affecting businesses daily. This episode, we will be featuring Francisco Cerezo, partner and chair of the U.S. Latin America practice, and Tony Navarro, executive vice president of Red Ventures and founder of Guide.com, a leader within the AI space.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to our second DLA Latin America Panorama Series podcast, where we focus on current affairs, current event, invite thought leaders, people from government, private sector, public sector, to just engage them in conversations which we think may be of interest to our friends across the Americas, globally indeed, but focusing primarily on matters that touch on Latin America. And by the way, our maiden podcast was extremely well received, so we're extremely happy about that. We appreciate everyone's support. And we're delighted then to follow our maiden podcast now with a second podcast with distinguished guest, Tony Navarro. I'll say a few words on Tony's background just by way of context, but we're going to talk with Tony all things AI. AI, obviously, in 2023 was the big buzz, and we expect 2024 and probably 25, 26, and 27 AI to really be top of mind. Everyone's trying to understand what AI is. So we're delighted to have Tony as a guest to talk not only big picture what AI is, but then its implications to Latin America. So with that said, let me just lay a little bit of background. Tony actually came to the United States. I think you went to high school in Colombia and then went to UVA for undergrad, where he studied business undergrad. Then he went to the Kennedy School of Public Affairs of Government, where he got an MPA at Harvard, and then went on and got an MBA at Wharton. Since then, he's been involved in tech, in private equity, held a number of really senior positions. He's currently senior executive at Red Ventures, which is a well-established private equity firm that focuses primarily in the tech space and innovation. He's one of the founders of Nave Bank, and he's also one of the founders of Guide.com, which is a very cool new travel portal and application, which is integrating AI into the whole planning travel experience. So in any event, I couldn't think of anyone better than Tony, not only because of his academic and professional trajectory, but his deep knowledge of Latin America and how then AI fits in with everything that's going on in Latin America. I'm looking forward to a very engaging conversation where we'll talk about all sorts of things. So with that, Tony, welcome. Delighted to have you here.
Francisco, thank you so much for having me. Very excited to be here and talk all things AI.
Super. So, Tony, I guess to start off, I'm going to do a really open-ended question and let you run with it. So AI just blows my mind. Every time I see new implementation of AI here at DLA Piper, we have a market-leading legal practice focused on all things AI. And when I talk with my partners who focus primarily or exclusively on AI, the things and the applications and the solutions, the real-world applications for our clients just blow my mind. So what I've seen so far, I'm sure, is just the tip of the iceberg. If you could just paint the four corners, everyone talks about ChatGPT and AI, maybe a little bit of the history of what AI ChatGPT is, and then we'll go from there.
Absolutely. When people say ChatGPT, really, in my view, stands for something much bigger. The real term here is generative pre-trained transformer. But the GPT also stands for general purpose technology. Now, if we zoom out in the history of humanity, we've had several key technologies that have had significant inflection points in the development of our civilization. As an example, agriculture. It took us from being nomads to being able to establish ourselves. The wheel enabled significant progress there. The printing press, the steam engine. And these general purpose technologies started to accelerate over time, and the level of discovery, the rate of discovery, accelerated along with it. In the past 100 years, we've seen significant inflection here on these new technologies, things like the transistor, the personal computer, the internet. And now we've got into what is the nexus of the modern age of AI. AI, as we know, has become a general purpose technology, and it's taking us into an exponential curve of progress where every single industry we can imagine will be impacted by this, much like the computer impacted the way we operate, the way we work, the way we communicate, the internet, the mobile phone, and now we have the age of AI. Now, what really brought us to this point and why now is the time are three key factors. On one end, obviously, computers have been around since the mid-20th century, have had tremendous level of progress powered by Moore's law, but we've now gotten to the point where we have incredibly powerful computers at a very reasonable scale and reasonable price. Second to this, we have data. Data began in the early 2000s, and after 2010, it was all about big data. And people talked about data being the new oil. But if data was the oil, we were missing the combustion engine. And that really is what the new algorithms that have been developed are. When we look at large language models, and these really are models that were born from neural networks, technologies that, by the way, the concept of neural networks have been around since the mid-1900s, but it wasn't until today that we had enough compute and enough data to make it work and happen. So in the early 2010s, we came out with a bunch of new algorithms, neural networks particularly, and then this concept of large language model, which really was developed in 2017 or so. We had what is called the transformer. And this transformer concept, which really is just a clever way of computers being able to predict the next token, the next word, the next letter, or the next X in a code, was then adopted, and OpenAI was born around the same time. And they introduced GPT around 2019, 2020. GPT has been around for a while, but it used to be only accessible to coders. It could only predict so much. It was expensive, etc. But then comes the end of 2022, where they introduced ChatGPT. And what made ChatGPT so powerful is that they created a natural language interface that enabled a non-coder, somebody that's of a non-technical background, to engage with these machines, with these large language models, where I can speak to the machine and the machine can speak back to me. This is very much akin to the development of the operating system, where before, remember, you had to know C++ or punch cards or whatnot, MS-DOS, and for the layman, it was very hard to use a computer. But what really brought the personal computer to the modern age was the development of that interface of the mouse and an operating system, where now I could engage with the computer, I could control it, and it could give me an output. Now we've created natural language interfaces where I can speak without any kind of technical terms to a system, and it will respond in the same way to me. And by the way, that's where it gets very exciting, because where we are today is what is called multimodality. But we've gotten now to the stage where we can get images, videos, audio, code, anything you could potentially imagine, these models can now use as output. And as they get better and better, we're going to start creating what are called agents, AI that can operate independently, autonomously on their own across different mediums, and taking us toward that vision of artificial general intelligence. Now, whether we've hit that threshold of AGI, as it's called, or not, up for debate. I would argue we have gotten to that point where many of these systems can now possibly pass a Turing test or already do. So an incredibly exciting time to be in this space. Obviously, tremendous amount of implications around the world, but every single industry you can imagine, even if you do not deal within tech, you will be impacted by AI on a go-forward basis. And we've only covered what it really is, generative AI, but there's significant advances on computer vision that enables self-driving cars, significant advancements on robotics. I just saw a video the other day of a robot folding a shirt. So we've gotten to the point where all angles of automation and robotics and artificial intelligence are gaining significant momentum, and the genie's out of the bottle. There's absolutely no way to put this back in there. And we're going to see significant transformation in, I would say, decade and a half to come. The level of discovery will be incredibly exciting.
So let me ask you a question, because you mentioned OpenAI as essentially the developer, if you will, of this technology. I'm wondering if you could give me a little bit of context of how this is being thrust forward and who the players are. So when you hear about OpenAI, is this just a very significant player, but there are others that have alternative platforms for AI? Or I don't know if the word would be platform. So, I mean, if you could give us a little sense of where we are in that regard today.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's a great question. There are really two camps in the world of AI model development. There are the private groups, like OpenAI used to be open source or open, hence the OpenAI. They've now since closed their structure a little bit more. But you have the private development shops. There are a number of these shops out there. But then there's also a significant movement in the open source community. The open source community is fairly advanced, and they're actually lagging the closed developers by only a few months. So we're going to see a neck-to-neck development here. And the reason for that open source movement is really twofold. On one end, AI has always been driven a lot by research, and these researchers love publishing, and they publish a lot of papers, and there's a lot of prestige in these researchers being able to publish. These researchers like publishing their work, and as a function of that, they're sharing knowledge. So with the moment they share knowledge, other people can start replicating what they're doing. So that's one aspect of the open source movement. The other one is there's this notion of control. If we look at the internet, nobody controls the internet really. The internet is an open platform that has taken on a life of its own. And there are certain people that fear significant level of control in the hands of few. There's another company that is from France, and they're also putting out a lot of these models that other people can take. They can train it up on content and deploy them on their own. But we do have these two camps. The private closed environments obviously have more coordination, more funding, can move a little bit faster, but the open source movement is very, very close behind and moving very rapidly. Okay. What's happening across the board is these what we call foundational model developers. The foundation model, think of a GPT as a foundation model. There are a bunch of different flavors. The difference there is the size of the model, how capable the model is, and how it's been fine-tuned, how it performs, and how they can tweak it to determine how it actually performs on the outputs. That's what fine-tuning means. And they will vary by flavor, but they have all started to partner up with what we call hyperscale companies. As part of that compute, you also need significant level of distribution. If we want to deploy one of these models, it's very expensive because of the hardware required today. They're going to get better and better. You can now run some of these models on your laptop, actually, which is empowering at the same time scary, depending on who is a person running that model on their laptop. But those really are the two camps that we should view right now. All the big tech players are some of the usual suspects involved in this race. So it'll be very exciting to see how these worlds continue to develop on a go-forward basis.
So this is great background as the four corners of how we got here and what this is all about. We now move the conversation a little bit more to Latin America. But one thing I was talking about with some friends is how global is this, or is this technology that essentially works really well and blows everyone's mind if it's in English? So basically focus in the US or maybe Western Europe, or is this truly accessible globally if you're sitting in China, or if you're sitting in Africa, or anywhere else in Asia, or in Latin America, which we'll get into in a second? How accessible is it? Does it translate? Does it capture? Does it work? So on the margins of that conversation, and actually just in jest with a couple of friends and with my sister, we actually gave instructions to ChatGPT to write something in the style of, probably near and dear to your house as a Colombian, in the style of Gabriel Garcia Marquez. And I asked to write kind of like a short poem in the style of Garcia Marquez. And it did an amazing job at that. And then I gave it another cue. Well, put this in the style of Pablo Neruda. And it did that. And then just basically it kept evolving with the same theme I gave it, because we gave it some parameters, a poem celebrating the life of this friend and all of it in the style of Gabriel Garcia Marquez. And when we said Neruda, it did it phenomenally well. Then I said Octavio Paz, and it did it really well. All authors that I'm quite familiar with. So when I read these, it really seemed like something that I'm sure academics would probably read it and deconstruct it and say, oh, maybe it didn't capture this nuance. And then interestingly, we shifted and we started saying, well, now do it in English in the style of the cliche Shakespeare. And then I said Faulkner. It really just kind of blew our mind. And by the way, this is not, oh, I'll get back to you in an hour and you'll hear from our customer service rep and whatnot. This is kind of in real time. So it blew our mind how certainly it captured the nuance of Latin American literature and literary giants, and of certain Western literature figures, both from the US and the UK in literature. So where I'm going with this is talk about the nuance and the applicability of all of this technology to, let's just get to it, to Latin America, right? Where at the end of the day, Latin America is not this monolithic. It's not this one giant country. There's clear differences between someone who's in the Dominican Republic versus Argentina versus Nicaragua versus Colombia, so on and so forth. They're very different. Perhaps there's a number of similarities between all those countries, and they're probably more similar than they are to a country in Asia, but they're still very distinct cultures with their idiosyncrasies, their nuances and whatnot. So the portability, how global is AI? The first question I have. I just think it's really interesting from that perspective.
No, it's a fantastic question. A very complex question on multiple different levels. Right at the surface, this is a general purpose technology. It will impact humanity across the board. Part of the beauty of these models is that because they can predict, they can translate very easily, and oftentimes without even training on that language. So as an example, simply how they've been manufactured or put together, they can, without having been trained in French, speak French or traduce and translate into French. So that is incredibly empowering, where now we can take a tool and disseminate it around the world, and odds are that it can likely engage in all the dialects and all the languages around the world. Now, obviously, the availability is certainly predicated on the digital divide, ensuring that people have access to smart device, access to connectivity, and are sufficiently tech literate in order to know how to engage with the technologies. So those are really the moats to what I would call accessibility. Now, to your point as well on, is this regional? Yes. And in what way is that next wave we're going to see happening now are regionalizations of the models, because part of the issue is that the Western world is probably the most represented on the web. And anything digital, when you train these models, when you put these models together, you need to siphon and consume tremendous amount of content. And the provenance of that content tends to be Western democracies. You're going to have different flavors happening. In China, you have your own China model. However, here's where rubber hits the road. There is a right to be remembered. What happens in societies or content that was never digitized or sufficiently represented online, where you hit with some of the authors like Neruda, Octavio Paz, Garcia Marquez, but you could get into much more nuanced authors that may simply have never been digitized because they were authors from the 1800s and nobody took the time to put them online. So there is a significant need for us to be able to digitize our historical vaults of content of our culture as well, and ensure that these are in digital format and capable of being absorbed and baked into one of these models. Otherwise, we're going to lose the relevancy. We're going to lose the nuance of, you can speak to this model in Spanish, but it may speak to you like a Spaniard from Spain. Right. And the mannerisms it's going to expect from people are going to be mannerisms from Spain, simply because Uruguay or Bolivia or Belize isn't sufficiently represented, or the model doesn't have enough basis to really be able to provide a representative view of that culture, of that language, of that history. So I do think it's incumbent on the nation states, frankly, on the populations of us in Latin America as Latinos, to really think about, do we have the proper digital exhaust? Are we represented properly in the way that these models are being put together? And are we making sure that whatever conception, because part of the issue with these models is also bias. It comes with a lot of different biases, to ensure that the models aren't providing negative biases against us. And some of these biases, as you know, will likely be negative simply because of the coverage of information on the internet or digital content that's out there. So I guess in a nutshell, it's all about access, making sure we get people an opportunity to have the device, the connectivity to interface with these technologies, and also make them AI literate, which does require training, and we can get it to education shortly. But then also at the same time to ensure that we're properly represented and that Latin America has champions. France, as I mentioned earlier, has this company who's developing a lot of interesting stuff. The UK also is becoming an AI powerhouse. The UAE put out a model, and that model is fantastic. But it was also trained on local information and local content. So if they want an Arab world version flavor of that model, they now have that. And that is fantastic. I've yet to see, and we're starting obviously Latin, and I think we're very industrial and we have strong entrepreneurial spirit. There's no doubt that we're going to start seeing clusters of AI research, of AI companies being born in Latin America, but it's absolutely important that we do see these clusters so these ecosystems are born, because the ecosystem then has a bunch of different knock-on effects. There's a whole value chain behind AI around data literacy, around our engineers, our STEM. How do we get them prepared to be able to be relevant in the world of tomorrow? And at the same time have technology that's impacting our local economies and not being left behind. I don't necessarily think we'll be left behind, but this is an aggressive environment where it does become more concentrated than before. The capital owner in the world of AI will have a higher hand than not, because they will have the data, they will have these models, they can move faster, they can make smarter decisions. If our local industries, our local companies are not tapping in this power early and now and learning how to use this, I believe our local champions across the region are potentially in threat of being left behind if we don't move forward. The good news is it's still very early, and it's still blue skies ahead.
That's really interesting. I mean, just a quick note, and not to go down that rabbit hole. It's interesting because translation is so much more than just translating words. It's how it goes across cultures and meaning and the history behind it. Because just playing around with it on ChatGPT, I translated one of those poems. I actually did, translate it now into French and translate it now into Italian. Then I actually said, translate it into Mandarin. And I have no idea if what it put out was Mandarin, but it looked like Mandarin. And the speed with which it did it just blew my mind. And seeing how accurate it is in languages I do feel comfortable with, that also blew my mind. What you mentioned is really interesting. I wanted to ask you about the digital divide and the barrier to access to this, particularly in countries that perhaps connectivity, access to the internet and whatnot is a lot more limited. So I would love your thoughts on the digital divide. But what you just mentioned now actually takes it even further, because the digital divide doesn't only apply to the users to being able to have access to this. It's the content, if you will, or the data or the information that will be there, right? I don't want to give specific examples of names, because if you're a country with very limited resources, it's not going to be in the same position as perhaps in the Emirates or France. There's not going to be the sovereign resources to have some sort of institution or think tank or government entity generating all this information so that it just goes deep into the recesses of the history and the culture and just the wealth of historic information that there may be about X, Y, or Z country. So that country, not only its individual users and citizens, will perhaps fall behind if they can't have access to the internet because they live in a remote village. But as a country, they may find themselves disadvantaged because they're not going to be able to participate as fully as more developed countries. I hadn't thought about that. And when you just mentioned how this is so driven also by countries focusing on getting this data out there. But if you could speak to your thoughts and what you've seen, I know you're very involved in thought leadership on this front, on the digital divide, especially as it applies to Latin America in particular.
Yeah, I think all the things you mentioned are very true. And there needs to be, at the country level, at the policy level, a lot of thinking around what's happening here. There are significant implications to copyright, to IP ownership, to your right as a citizen now with respect to your personal data, what's called PII. How are these models using it? How are they dealing with it? How can companies exploit the data that's obtained from people within a particular region or country? So there needs to be a programmatic agenda and thought leadership at that local level, trying to look at what are the key enablers in order to get an economy of people engaged in this future, and to also create a very functional, capable economic framework where private sector actors can really thrive within it. And we will feel, by the way, talking about our ability to compete in the next generation of technology, we are going to feel disruption. A lot of people talk about AI taking over jobs, which is certainly true. The irony in the whole AI jobs landscape conversation is the following. People always thought that the blue-collar jobs were going to be the first one to be automated. And that's where we see this Jetson-like robots being thought up back in the 1900s. And it turns out building a robot is actually pretty difficult because of the precision required. So what we've seen with these large language models are that the first areas to get impacted are actually knowledge workers, white collar. Anywhere you see repetitive activities or some that are relatively standardized, models can certainly move into that space. And then we thought that creativity was completely off grounds because that was the human domain. That's what made us magical. We were creative beings and no machine could ever replicate that. Well, it turns out that these models can hallucinate, quote unquote. That hallucination is essentially being imprecise. It's randomness that's introduced into the model that it believes to be true, or it believes to be the next thing you predict. So what we've seen is the creative industries being significantly upheavaled by these models across the board. The Hollywood strike last year was all about the use of generative AI in those creative industries. So what is film? What is music? What is imagery? And just creativity, generally speaking, is going to be significantly impacted. Now, when we put the focus on Latin America, where I get a little skittish, are all the activities that, from a knowledge economy perspective, we've grown to connect ourselves to the US, as an example, tend to be some of the tasks that can likely be automated. As an example, call centers, BPOs as well. Those are perfect for AI to step in. And I've seen technology that will blow your mind where a computer will engage with you as if it were a human. Odds are, after a certain amount of time, you'll pick out that computer is, in fact, that it's an entity, right? It's a computer. But this is the tip of the iceberg. These things will only get better from here. This is the worst we'll ever see this technology. And it's getting better incredibly quickly. Within 6 months, we could automate an entire call center. all with computers, and they'll do a fantastic job. They'll work 24/7, and that's the beginning. Then we can start outsourcing finance, accounts receivable, accounts payable, compliance work, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This keeps going on and on and on. So we've seen job displacement before. We had the Industrial Revolution, where if you were weaving baskets or making shirts, suddenly you had these now steam engine run factories that were replacing your work. But that took decades to take place. It took actually hundreds of years to really have significant dislocation. And for us as a society to really develop a true social contract around what the relationship was now between the capital owner and the employee. What's happening in the AI space is going to be so much more accelerated. And we really need to think carefully around, okay, well, what are the industries that are going to be impacted? Because these are near-term impacts. Within 5 years, we're going to see tremendous level of dislocation. And what are we going to do with these populations or with these sectors of the economy that we need to retrain, we need to upskill, and we need to find them jobs that will offer them the opportunity to have a decent living? And certainly, new jobs will appear. One in particular is interesting. It's transient, though, not permanent, but we've seen a lot of human training for these algorithms. So the algorithm starts spitting out information, and you have a human that actually rates it thumbs up, thumbs down, or how good was that response. And there are armies of people out there rating and getting these models to behave better. It's an example of a new type of job that's being created, but that's certainly a very short-lived one because these models are getting so capable, they can now rate themselves. So you never know. I work in tech. My job wouldn't have existed 20 years ago. So it's hard to predict what are the new roles that are going to come up.
Right.
So time will tell, but we do need to figure out a way to continue upskilling and carrying these populations that will have the dislocation forward and making sure they're not left behind and that our collective community and collective population is still optimistic about the future. There's a lot of trepidation, and that's where we need to be very thoughtful around how we deploy these technologies, how we play in, and ensure that we have the social safety nets and the policy level agenda to create the right social contract between capital owner and employee.
Right. So I want to be mindful of our time because I could geek out with you here. I think this is all fascinating. I know that the podcast, by definition, we try to keep in a certain time frame, and I could just hear your thoughts on this for hours. I saw that recently, just actually last year, the response to President Biden's State of the Union, there was an AI-generated response ad, which was released like in record time by the Republican Party. Putting aside politics, whether you're a Democrat or Republican, it was a good ad. It was basically the Republican response in basically a 30 or 45-second commercial that was put out in record time. We've seen ads like that before, but years ago, it would require top-level political strategists to then probably pull an all-nighter with a huge team of people, and then the ad would maybe start making the rounds a day or two later. This was almost in real time. I don't know what technology they used, but it was AI-driven, generated, whatnot. So that's gotten me to think. Obviously, there's all the issues of how AI has all these wonderful implications, but it could also have some sinister uses, including misinformation, which unfortunately is something that's characterized the age in which we live in, where there's a lot of misinformation out there. And if you could go beyond that and start manipulating images and actually make someone seem like they did or said something which they absolutely didn't, but rather it was a virtual or an artificial intelligence generated avatar that is indistinguishable from the real individual, the consequences at that level, but even beyond, politically, geopolitically, just think about how that could be used for tremendous good on the one hand, but for tremendous harm. For the minutes that we have left on the podcast, maybe on an open-ended, engage you in your thoughts on the geopolitical, political informations, how it touches on misinformation. I know you have some really interesting thoughts on it that we've discussed offline. So I put this out there as something that is of great concern to a lot of people, right? That we all sit here and say, this is amazing, but this could really lead to also some really sinister uses and whatnot. I would love your thoughts if you could tell me if there's a specific tool for that. Is there an AI tool that is able to then say, oh, that's a fake, as opposed to that's real? Is there already something there? I don't know that we'll have time to show it, but just as a quick aside, Tony pointed me in the direction of an application that generated an AI version of Francisco. And in 5 minutes, I did a little video. It got my face, it got my speech and whatnot. And it came out with like a whole little clip as if it was me speaking. And it wasn't 100% spot on, but the first draft of it just blew my mind. And I wonder, is there also technology that could call that out and say, oh, no, that's a fake. That's not the real Francisco. So in any event, that's the one very specific micro question that I'd like. If there's already AI solutions that could call out when AI is being misused for like deep fakes. I know you have a lot of really interesting things to say is the geopolitical and specific implications of this wonderful technology in all of us, including in Latin America, where misinformation and manipulation has been the order of the day, sadly, for decades, even well before AI was. This just can turbocharge a lot of that.
100%, 100%. Obviously, there's a lot of optimism around what AI can do, right? The impacts to healthcare are going to be incredible in Latin America. The impact to education is going to be incredible as well. But to your question specifically, and really it relates to that digital divide as well, because we need to build AI awareness around what these tools are capable of doing. And if we go back to that digital divide and people don't have access or aren't aware that these things can do what they can do, and I'm sitting in a remote city in whatever country in Latin America, and I see an ad or a video played of the president saying XYZ that's incredibly inflammatory toward my ethnic group or whatnot, then that would inflame me. And it create significant level of friction. And as a democracy, we cannot function. The reason democracies were born was as a function of a properly well-educated, literate population that could make decisions collectively. If we do not have an AI literate populace that is aware of all the misinformation that's going to be pumping out of these systems, it's going to be an incredibly challenging environment because people do not have the source of truth to make the right decisions. And this year will be incredibly interesting to see what happens in the US. The amount of misinformation, we thought last election was bad. Wait till you see everything that's going to happen this election with what's called synthetic content put out there. In Latin America, it's going to be no different. But my worry about Latin America is making sure that people are aware that if you hear my voice on a tape, I may have not said that. Or if you see me on a video doing XYZ, I may not have done that. So there is significant risk there as to what could potentially happen. And when we look at the democracies that we have, that may not be as mature institutionally and may not be able to endure certain strife or may not be able to withhold certain political movements or political activities from people, then we get into hot water here around really focusing on the true properly operating democracy. So to your specific question around detection of deepfakes, this is an area that the AI labs have spent a ton of time on. OpenAI actually released, as you know, a lot of students were using ChatGPT for writing their essays at school and whatnot. So OpenAI came out with a tool for detection. It turns out the tool was imprecise and they had to take it down because detecting fake content, we have not been able to have 100% hit rate. So what happens if suddenly I'm accusing a student who never plagiarized work of plagiarism? This actually happened in a pretty famous case last year. So there's a lot of investment going toward detection of fake content media, specifically around the detection of audio, detection of generated video. So very specific answer to your question, what are the key solutions to this is watermarking the content, putting imperceptible signs that the content is fake. Now, whether it be an audio, whether it be in the image, a small pixel here or there that wouldn't be detected by the AI or it'll be replicated by the AI. And that's how we're detecting. These systems will get better and better and better, especially given the open source movement where you have bad actors with access to incredibly powerful models. These models are phenomenally powerful. If you have intent and you are really trying to do something, you can possibly achieve a state-of-the-art solution. And that's where it's going to be a bit of an arms race, really trying to bat back all these bad actors using all these different technologies, but always we're trying to institutionalize a source of truth. So how do I know a video came from CNN? What's called provenance. How can I demonstrate the provenance of the content in a verifiable manner? And that's where a lot of investment has been going to. So unless it's verifiable, I shouldn't believe it.
As a quick note before we continue, this reminds me again of the importance of the fourth estate, right? Of robust independent news sources that are trustworthy, because back in the day, you could look to that anchor, the Voice of America, let's say Walter Cronkite, and people trusted that. So as more of these things happen and this comes to be, it also speaks to the importance of robust, independent, serious journalism to help safeguard this, to help put guardrails around this and make sure that people can distinguish the wheat from the chaff. But in any event, just had that thought. So please continue.
On that point, I think it's a phenomenal point. And there's no better time to have that than now. And those business models are under incredible pressure today, where now you can have all these models putting out content left and right and imitating New York Times pieces and whatnot. So we need to figure out, and that's part of the intentional agenda from either private sector or nonprofit or even the state sector. State obviously more contentious because of interest there, but how do we keep this afloat, and how do we make sure that we have true unbiased reporting out there that is verifiable and doesn't necessarily depend on a journalistic business model like the ones that we have, because as we all know, the news sector is under tremendous pressure.
Yeah. As we wind down, there's so much we could talk about. I know you just briefly touched on healthcare, the access to AI-powered healthcare to people in remote villages. That is such a phenomenal positive aspect of this. If you're in a remote village in the Andes, you will have access. Obviously, that assumes that there's enough of an internet connection and whatnot, but there's so many things we could talk about, how this impacts healthcare, microfinance, agriculture, development of crops, you name it. I think we're going to have you back for several more podcasts and make those a lot longer, but we're running out of time. I know you have a number of things in your head that you'd like to share. Maybe spend a couple of minutes on anything else you think it's important at this stage of where things are in early 2024 and the road ahead that you want to leave us, especially to the bulk of our audience that looks to get your thoughts on how AI interfaces with Latin America.
Yeah, absolutely. We spent a good amount of the pod talking about the risks and the threats, but I can spend an equal amount of time on the opportunities and the excitement around AI. I am as optimistic, as excited, and so grateful to be living in this time in humanity, because we are going to see a level of discovery that it's a Cambrian explosion of new things that are coming up, new materials, new medical treatments. The quality of life across the board is going to rising tide for humanity across every aspect of society that you can imagine. So it's an incredibly exciting time. The important thing here is lean into this. Do not be afraid of it. If you analyze too much, you're going to paralyze. It's important that you get your hands dirty, you start testing. As our stakeholders in Latin America, make sure we are researching, make sure we are experimenting, make sure we are adopting some of these tools, we're collaborating, and ultimately we're thinking, because this does require new paradigms to be designed. And it's no better time than now to begin. It's still the tip of the iceberg. We are at less than 1% of what this is going to bring. So if you thought you've been left already behind because you don't use ChatGPT, nonsense. We are in the equivalent of 1994 if you draw a parallel to what the web eventually became. So with that, encourage everybody to really dig in, dig deep, have fun, and let's create some value together. I think there's a lot of opportunity and upside for Latin America here.
Thank you, Tony. Gracias. This was terrific. Exceeded my expectations. I knew you were going to be great, but this has been a really thoughtful and engaging discussion. Again, just the more I learn about this, the more my mind is blown. And I couldn't think of anyone better to engage in this discussion today. So thank you again, Tony. I hope everyone enjoyed our second Panorama series podcast of DLA Piper Latin America. Thank you for joining us, and we'll catch up on the next one. Gracias, Tony. Thank you again.
Francisco, gracias a ti.
Thank you for joining us and listening to DLA Piper's U.S. Latin America Panorama podcast. Please be sure to visit and follow us on LinkedIn under DLA Piper in Latin America and via dlapiper.com. If you have topics or speakers you'd like to suggest, please reach out to us at dlapiper.americas@dlapiper.com. Thank you for your interest. All information, content, and materials contained in this podcast are for general informational purposes only. This podcast is intended to be a general overview of the subjects discussed and does not create a lawyer-client relationship. Statements and opinions are those of the individual speakers and participants and do not necessarily reflect the policies or opinions of DLA Piper LLP US. The information contained in this podcast is not and should not be used as a substitute for legal advice. No listener should act or refrain from acting with respect to any particular legal matter on the basis of this podcast without first seeking legal advice from counsel in the relevant jurisdiction. This podcast may qualify as lawyer advertising, requiring notice in some jurisdictions. Prior results do not guarantee a similar outcome. DLA Piper LLP US accepts no responsibility for any actions taken or not taken as a result of this podcast.